in the poets of the Old Testament. And they said, wow, this is astonishing. There was a global connection, as they were saying. The main issues raised by the Egyptologists regarding the history of Sinuhe is the same one that confronts the readers of the Book of Abraham from the very beginning. This is the same stuff we're dealing with, see? With Abraham, as with the Egyptians, we are no longer justified in following the established school procedures of treating the whole thing as mythical, meaning simply made up or false, phony, crabbed, just of such little value that it's not worth our notice. Now, this is how the critics have approached it. But Nibley is showing the scholarship based upon the Egyptian texts should be the same scholarship that we base the Book of Abraham on. The same style, the same powerful connections, the same concern with giving it its due of comparing and cross-referencing, cross-checking, see how it compares to this text in time or that text in time, see how the rituals of another country are doing things, and so on and so forth. This was the scholarly method. This is the scholarly method that we should still be dealing with, but we continually refuse to do so. Nibley does so. And this is another reason why this book, Abraham in Egypt, could be quite difficult for most people, because we're not used to studying the scholarly methods in our scriptures, but we ought to be. It's a fascinating issue. One of the most remarkable things about the depth of Hugh Nibley's reading and of his research is how he is able to utilize the scholarship as well as the actual primary sources of two Egyptian stories, the story of Sinuhe and the story of the shipwrecked sailor, and to see how the Egyptologists themselves analyzed these materials and came to their conclusions regarding the interrelationship, the various connections between disciplines of scholarship, such as how do you study something to understand it to be a myth as opposed to reality, as opposed to actual history, or else as a ritual initiation and a ritual drama? Does this qualify as myth, or should we categorize this as history? How do we do this? And this was the essence of the scholarship on these Egyptian materials. What Nibley did is he also then simply brought in the Book of Abraham and analyzed it with the same tools and the same rigorous analysis. This is what makes Nibley somewhat difficult to follow, because most of us in our everyday life, I mean, hey, who's ever heard of the story of Sinuhe or the story of the shipwrecked sailor? I hadn't heard of it until I went and got them myself and studied these very sources that Nibley is using. I have these sources, so. And then on the other hand, it does enlighten us as to what is going on with our scriptures. It gives us a new impetus to really jump into our scriptures. This is the one thing I have so enjoyed about Hugh Nibley, is the impetus, the enthusiasm, the excitement of saying, hey, this thing really does fit. Hey, this thing really does make sense in that context. Most scholars or critics will simply fob off the Book of Abraham. Oh no, that's just myth. They don't have a clue as to the power of the Book of Abraham being myth. They use it in a modern disparaging sense, but with the textual analysis and the data available from the scholarly research methods, it had better be myth, because myth and history and ritual, all of this coalesces to give us a fundamental ground reality. And this is the beauty of this. It's not a dichotomy of myth versus history. No, it goes much broader and deeper than that. On a superficial level, the critics have approached it this way. But on the actual scholarship level, All of these aspects are interrelated, and powerfully so, and they have to be. They have to be. And so this is what Nibley does on pages 58, 59, and 60, which I'll share with you. I'm going to read a little bit here, and then I'll keep discussing it, because this is beautiful. This is very, very shocking. The main question about the Egyptian literatures that have been studied, as well as the Book of Abraham, well, how can you tell that there is any real history behind it? And what the scholars have come up with is so fascinating here, because the conditions that the writer describes are supported by purely historical sources. This is the point. It's impossible to keep the literature of ancient Egypt out of an interlinked literary historical nexus. In other words, even though we know we're reading literature, it is based on history. It is historical in that respect. It happens. This is not just a made-up fantasy like J.R.R. Tolkien's materials or other really powerful, wonderful modern writers that so many people love to enjoy. Though there is the widest disagreement among the specialists as to which part of the stories are history and which is fiction, with Abraham, as with the Egyptians, we are no longer justified in following the established school procedure of treating the whole thing as mythical. And so this gets important because in the confrontation of cultures, I'll put it that way, in the interaction between various cultures, whether it's ancient Canaan or Mesopotamia, Assyria, Babylon, Egypt, wherever it is, Israel, it doesn't matter what. The main issues regarding the history of Sinuhe is the same one that confronts us with the Book of Abraham. The question is, this presence in Palestine and Syria of Egyptian influences, is this a literary invention of the ancient Egyptian materials? There was trade and intermarriage between Egypt, Palestine, and Syria, and this wasn't just a one-time fluke thing. Not at all. It has a long-established history. It continued over long periods of time, we're told, and there's no justification for denying it in Sinuhe's day. The problem is we don't know a whole lot about this era of Sinuhe, any more than we know much about the patriarchal narratives as far as that goes. The mingling of the cult of Pharaoh with the Canaanites, this was derided early on against the Book of Abraham. They said, this is ridiculous. Joseph Smith made a huge historical blunder here because there was no intermixing. Egypt wasn't that far away, and Canaan didn't trade, or it wasn't involved with Egypt at all. Well, now that concept has been overturned through further scholarship and analysis. Purdy warns us. Purdy is the one who he's the scholar who studied the Sinuhe story. He warns us against the pitfalls of reading Egyptian like English. Oh boy, the critics need to take a lesson here, don't they? My goodness. Noting that it may be Egyptian literary usage to have Sinuhe talk so much about what he does not specify. In other words, things which he could not escape an Egyptian audience, but they often leave us in the dark. Sinuhe is not writing for the benefit of our English Egyptologists, in other words. What the ancient Egyptians basically took for granted, we wouldn't have a clue if it was an Egyptian literary technique if we don't compare and cross